Well, thank you everybody for tuning in today. This is a book that came out about a year ago, and I've had a chance to talk about it a lot in various places in the United States. But this is the first time I've had a chance to talk about it in this format, so I'm very excited to be here today to talk about my book, Raising the White Flag, How Surrender Defined the American Civil War. And I think one of the places to start might be this image, which was produced by the New York printmaker Currier and Ives. You may be familiar with them. They have a number of Christmas images that still get used today. And they made what I think is probably the first artistic depiction of Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. I think it came out only a few days, if not only a little bit over a week after the actual surrender itself. And Currier and Ives depicted the event as many would have envisioned it. The two men are alone. They're seated across the table from one another. Lee is writing the terms of the surrender, and he's got his sword resting between them on the table, while Grant waits for it, and his hands outstretched. And they actually made several different versions of this print. We have this one that's a landscape print. We have this other one here that's a portrait that's in color. And it's a great image. But unfortunately, the illustrators got nearly everything about the event wrong. Lee and Grant did not sit at the same table. They actually sat at two separate tables. The decor of the room looks very different from what the McLean parlor actually looks like. McLean parlor, for instance, does not have olive branch wallpaper. They weren't alone in the room. Lee had an aide with him, and Grant had at least a dozen members of his staff present. Grant actually wrote the original terms of surrender, and Lee made only minor modifications. Despite this picture's gross inaccuracies, though, I think it captures something of surrender's paradoxical nature. These two men appear as equals at the precise moment that they are radically unequal. They mirror each other in this image, but yet they are in some ways radically unequal, and that's their radical inequality that brought them to meet together. At this point, of course, Lee's army was surrounded, it was broken, it was outnumbered. Some of his men had not eaten for days, they could barely march, nevertheless fight. And the image captures none of these inequalities. Indeed, if you didn't know which man was the victor and which was the vanquished, it would be impossible to tell from the image itself. And in this respect, the Currier and Ives lithograph is in really good company. Artistic depictions of Appomattox Courthouse, both those made during the war and thereafter, often create this kind of very strange visual equivalency between those who are surrendering and those who are accepting surrender. And they allow the viewer to sort of figure out what the subtext is. One of my favorites of these is an image made in the 1920s, which is a much more accurate depiction of what the room looked like in terms of the people who were there and the kind of layout of the space. Well, the one thing I love about this image, and I use it often in teaching, is that if you didn't know that Lee is the man who lost the war at this point and Grant was the person that won the war, you wouldn't tell that from the picture. Lee looks like he's the victor and Grant looks like he is the subordinate position, when in fact that the opposite is the case. As a historian, one of the things that really interests me about surrender and the reason why I got involved in this project is that surrenders are really anomalous moments in times of war. They are a hiatus from bloodshed and death in favor of negotiation and compromise. They require both warring parties to consider alternatives to fighting to recognize the humanity in their enemy. And they require warring generals to sit across the table from each other, or in this case, from two adjacent tables, at the exact moment when their armies occupy decidedly unequal positions. And unlike war, which only requires an aggressor to begin, surrenders have to have both the victor and the defeated agree not to fight. And the Civil War is a war in which there is a lot of surrender. Surrender is one of these, as the subtitle indicates, one of the defining features of the American Civil War. It begins with a surrender at Fort Sumter, at least the way people conventionally talk about the war, and ends with a series of surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse, but also at Bennett Place, at Citronelle, at Jacksonport, and a number of other locations. And in between Fort Sumter and Appomattox, both Union and Confederate forces surrendered on dozens of occasions. Some of these surrenders are very well known. I'm imagining most people listening to this have heard of them, places like Fort Donelson, Harper's Ferry, and Vicksburg. But as this map indicates, there are dozens of other times, and I only put the major surrenders on this map, in which Union and Confederate armies surrender. And in the largest of these surrenders, soldiers numbering in the thousands laid down their arms. But also in nearly every Civil War battle, you found soldiers in a position where they saw choosing not to fight, throwing down their weapons, raising their arms in surrender seemed like the best option. And when taken as a whole, one of the things you find is that 1 out of every 4 Civil War soldiers surrendered at some point. A lot of them at the end of the war, but also really throughout the entire conflict, making it one of the most common experiences that soldiers had. Adding it all up, something on the order of 700,000 soldiers surrendered in the Civil War. About half of them are doing so in the context of large formal surrenders like at Vicksburg or at Appomattox Courthouse. And the other half are soldiers who are surrendering on the battlefield, who are in the midst of battles, finding themselves in a position where they need to surrender. And to put these figures into some context, the number of soldiers who surrendered in the Civil War is approximately equal to the number of soldiers who were killed. So if death shaped the Civil War, so too did surrender. And one of the things that struck me when I started this project was that there's really no other war in American history where surrenders happen so frequently. And indeed, I haven't been able to find a war in all of human history where surrender was such a prominent phenomenon. And yet, surrender in the Civil War seems at odds with a modern national sensibility that abhors surrender. In recent history, Americans of a variety of backgrounds have repudiated surrender, labeling it as un-American. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, in October of 1962, President Kennedy gave a very famous address on live television where he declared that the cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it, and the one path we will never choose, and that is the path of surrender. And what you find is that almost every major American politician since Kennedy has said some version of Americans never surrender. Richard Nixon said it, Ronald Reagan said it, George W. Bush said it, Barack Obama said it, John McCain has said it, President Trump has said it. And of course, these are men who don't agree on very much of anything else, but they all seem to abide by this notion that Americans never surrender. And yet, during the American Civil War, they surrendered really throughout the conflict. And so I wanted to make sense not only of why they surrendered so often, but how they made sense of it. What is it about surrender in the mid-19th century that made it a very different phenomenon than surrender in the 21st century? The obvious place to start when talking about surrender in the Civil War is with Fort Sumter. And I'm imagining with this audience, everyone is familiar with the story of Fort Sumter, the very lengthy siege of Major Robert Anderson's garrison that culminates in the Confederate General Beauregard's demand that Anderson surrender to the fort in April 11th, 1861, the bombardment that then begins, and 34 hours later, with the fort on fire, Robert Anderson surrendering his garrison and the fort to Confederates. That's a story I'm imagining everybody listening to this has heard multiple times. If you haven't, there's a great chapter on in the book. I recommend that to you. What I want to tell you then is 2 things about Fort Sumter that you probably don't know. One is that Fort Sumter is not the first surrender in the Civil War. There are actually surrenders that precede Fort Sumter, and none of them is as important as the surrender of General David Twiggs. Most people don't know too much about David Twiggs because his role in the Civil War really only lasts in its very early phases, and then he sort of fades into obscurity and dies before the war is over. But General David Twiggs was one of the most prominent members of the U.S. military before the Civil War. He held what is either the second or third highest post in the U.S. Army. And he held the command of the Department of Texas, which was a sort of set of 19 posts on the U.S.-Mexico border, where he was dealing with not only the U.S. relationships with Mexico, but also with Native Americans. It was a very prominent, important posting. And he surrenders to Confederates in February of 1861. So during the siege that's happening at Fort Sumter, but several months before Robert Anderson surrenders. And Twiggs and Anderson are a lot alike in many ways. They're both Southerners from slaveholding families. They were both career military men. They were both veterans of the Mexican War. But unlike Robert Anderson, Twiggs openly expressed Southern sympathies and asked officials in Washington to relieve him of command. Before a replacement arrived, however, pro-Confederate forces under Ben McCulloch surrounded his headquarters in San Antonio. You see there a picture of his headquarters in San Antonio, which may be familiar to some of you. It's the Alamo, which of course famously didn't surrender during the Texas War of Independence. But here, David Twiggs surrendered it without firing a shot, without putting up any defense at all in February of 1861. And when news of Twiggs' surrender reaches the East Coast, most northern newspapers conclude that Twiggs was a traitor and a coward in surrendering under sudden dishonorable terms. He's compared to Benedict Arnold. He's labeled as really the first villain of the Civil War in many ways. And there are two interesting eyewitnesses to Twiggs' surrender. One was Robert Anderson's younger brother, Charles, who happened to live in San Antonio at the time. And he writes a letter to his brother, who was then under siege at Fort Sumter during this sort of long standoff that precedes the firing of Fort Sumter. He writes a letter to his brother. One of the amazing things about the siege in Fort Sumter is they get regular mail delivery the entire time. Robert Anderson actually gets fan mail that he answers while he's under siege. His brother Charles writes him this letter, and he says that Twiggs' surrender was, quote, treason pure and simple. And he warns his brother not to surrender under similar circumstances. The other eyewitness of note is Colonel Robert E. Lee, who at this point has not yet resigned his commission from the U.S. Army and happens to be passing through San Antonio on the day that Twiggs surrendered. And we have somebody describing Lee when he hears the news that Twiggs surrendered, and he breaks out in tears. What exactly that meant for Lee, we're not quite sure. We know that Lee and Twiggs met later that day after Twiggs surrendered. What they talked about is a mystery. But this is, in some ways, the first big surrender, and it's an example, in some ways, of how not to surrender. Twiggs surrendered his fort without putting up a fight, without firing a shot, and that's what made his surrender so distasteful to many people in the North. The second thing about Fort Sumter that people probably don't know is what happened to Robert Anderson and his garrison after they surrendered. And what happened is that they were allowed to leave the fort. They boarded a ship, the USS Baltic, and they traveled to New York City. And there, when they arrived on April 19th, they were greeted as heroes. The city, New York City, holds an enormous rally for them in Union Square, an event which I think would have been appropriate for a victorious general. 100,000 New Yorkers mobbed the area to see Anderson and his men. The New York Times said it was the entire population of the city. And there are a series of speakers who praise their gallantry and their bravery for sustaining themselves in the smoke and the flames. Here we see some images that show that. One is the one in the image on the right is from a map from 1861, which shows Anderson as the hero of Fort Sumter. The image on the left is from Harper's Weekly that shows Anderson and his other officers. Anderson, as you can see, is seated there, second from the left. Next to him on the far left seated is his second in command, Abner Doubleday, I always like to point this out. Abner Doubleday is most famous for not inventing baseball. During the early part of the 20th century, when they were trying to figure out who invented baseball, somebody said that, oh, it was the Civil War hero Abner Doubleday who invented baseball in Cooperstown, New York, and people believe that, and that's why the Baseball Hall of Fame is in Cooperstown, New York. Turns out none of that's true, but he was a hero at Fort Sumter. Anderson's surrender at Fort Sumter, though, becomes the template for how you can surrender honorably during the Civil War. If you're under fire, you can't retreat, you can't continue fighting without exposing your men to undue danger, then surrender was entirely appropriate. And indeed honorable, and in the case of Anderson, you can see even heroic. Anderson ends up getting promoted after he surrendered. He made a general, although I guess early in the Civil War, almost anybody in high command in the Army. So it's not seen as a shameful action, it's seen as being the proper choice for an officer to make in that situation. And that really remains the standard for both armies from the very beginning of the war, really to the very end. And just to show you this, I'm going to give you an example from really the very end of the war. Here's a picture, by the way, of the crowd at Major Anderson's event in New York City. The example I want to give you from the very end of the war is May of 1865. And you may say to yourself, well, didn't the war end in April of 1865? Well, it did for most people in the Confederacy, but there are still some people left in May who are still fighting, mostly, or at least still haven't surrendered yet. And the most important of which is Edmund Kirby Smith, who is the commander of the Trans-Mississippi Department. So he controls Texas, a little bit of Arkansas, a little bit of Louisiana. But he is sort of the last major commander standing. This is more than a month after Appomattox. It's after Joe Johnston surrenders. It's after Richard Taylor surrenders. It's after Jeff Thompson surrenders. It's after Jefferson Davis has been captured. After all of those things have happened, the Union Army sends a courier to Edmund Kirby Smith, asking him if he'd like to surrender. And Kirby Smith had been effectively cut off from the rest of the Confederacy for a number of years after the fall of Vicksburg and the Union control of the Mississippi River. And Kirby Smith said, no, I don't want to surrender. And the courier was somewhat surprised by this and said, well, can you explain why? Because I have to go back to my boss and tell them why we won't surrender. And so Kirby Smith writes in this very lengthy letter where he says why he can't surrender. He says, an officer can honorably surrender his command when he has resisted the utmost of his power, and no hope rests upon his further efforts. What Kirby Smith is saying there is he's saying, I can't surrender yet because you haven't attacked me yet. It would be dishonorable for me to surrender until such a time as that's the only choice left to me. But because you haven't attacked me yet, I haven't yet met the threshold that had been established at Fort Sumter at the beginning of the war. Now, Kirby Smith's under no illusions that were he to be attacked, that he could win. He's under no illusions that the Confederacy would rise again. But he has a clear understanding of when surrender is appropriate and when it's not. And he doesn't want to be like David Twiggs, surrendering prematurely. He wants to surrender when and if that proper set of thresholds are met. Nearly all of the surrenders that happened in the Civil War do meet that threshold and are seen as honorable by participants on both sides. There are a handful of cases, though, and I talk about this in great detail in the book, about those cases where people surrender prematurely. And probably the most famous surrender that happens prematurely and is seen as dishonorable as a consequence is the surrender at Harper's Ferry in 1862. This is the largest Union surrender in the entire war. This is, of course, part of the Maryland campaign in 1862 leading up to Antietam. Harper's Ferry was a strategically important location really throughout the war. It changes hands a number of times. At this point, it's under the command of Dixon Miles, who is a career soldier, but his main distinguishing feature over a very long career is he managed somehow not to get kicked out of the Army despite being grossly incompetent for most of it. And he allows Stonewall Jackson to put Harper's Ferry under siege, but really before the fighting even really starts, he decides to surrender the town to Stonewall Jackson's men. Dixon Miles, luckily or unluckily for him, depending on the way you want to think about it, doesn't live to hear how roundly he gets criticized for his actions, because as soon as he raises the white flag to surrender, a cannon shell hits him in the leg and he bleeds to death on the field. But he is seen as being he's villainized in Congress, he's villainized in the press for surrendering prematurely. But he in some ways is the exception, because the vast majority of people, as I said, who surrendered are seen as doing so honorably and in some ways heroically. Approximately half the soldiers who surrendered during the war are surrendered by their commanding officer. The other half, though, are soldiers who are choosing to surrender in the midst of battle, throwing down their guns, raising their hands, or raising a white flag, yelling, "I surrender," before being taken prisoner. And one of the things that really interested me about the people who surrender on the battlefield is this is really one of the few times where soldiers get to choose what it is they're doing in the context of battle. They are, after all, told when to march, when to fight, when to fire, who to fire at. But choosing to surrender was really a choice that a soldier got to make for themselves. In some ways, it's a choice that two soldiers had to make. One soldier had to surrender, and another soldier had to accept that surrender. And for soldiers who served for longer than a year, there was a very high chance that they were either going to surrender, something on the order of 1 out of every 6 soldiers who served for more than a year surrendered at some point, and an even greater chance that they would have to accept the surrender of an enemy soldier. So it's something in the order of 300,000 soldiers made this choice. And obviously, this is an extraordinarily important choice that they're making, one with immediate consequences for their life or death. And while officers who surrendered prematurely were seen as cowards for surrendering when they shouldn't, soldiers were never labeled as cowards for surrendering on the battlefield. And I think this largely has to do with the fact that soldiers who are surrendering have to be very close to the enemy to do so. In order to surrender on the battlefield, you have to be close enough to the enemy where they can hear you yell that you surrender. They have to see you raise your hand and make sense of all that with all the smoke and cacophony and chaos of the battlefield. So the people who surrender on the battlefield tend not to be the shirkers or the cowards who are running to the back. The people who surrender on the battlefield tend to often be the bravest of soldiers, the ones who are the last to retreat when everyone else has run away, or the first to advance, and that's why they've ended up so close to the enemy. And choosing and deciding whether to surrender or not on the battlefield, soldiers thought a lot about what life as a POW would be like, what life would be like after they surrendered. And here what I found was that soldiers' expectations changed significantly over the course of the war. At the very beginning of the conflict, neither Union or Confederate governments gave much thought to what they would do with prisoners of war, nor indeed did soldiers think very much about ending up as a prisoner. One Union soldier observed in 1861, "Most of us had realized we were liable to be sick, wounded, or killed, but had not dreamed of the possibility of being captured." And accounts of prison life, POW camps in 1861 and early 1862 indicate that these facilities, while often unsanitary and deeply unpleasant, they bore little resemblance to the venues they would later become. When people think of Civil War prisons, they often think of places like Andersonville, which date from 1864. Civil War prisons, especially in this very early stage, are very different. Letters written from Camp Chase, one of the Union POW camps near Columbus, Ohio, indicates the Confederate prisoners there felt well treated for. For instance, William Coleman, who was part of the force surrendered at Fort Donelson, wrote to his mother that the prisoners live in comfortable houses large enough to entertain 12 or 15 persons. And he says that the rations they get are of the same quality and quantity they give their own soldiers. This first phase of POW experience ends in 1862 with the creation of the Dix Hill Cartel, which was an agreement between Union Confederate governments over how to exchange prisoners. And it set up the system whereby all prisoners had to be paroled within 10 days of being captured, including those who are held at the time of the agreement. And so it's a two-stage process. The first is you can be paroled, and then you are paroled on the promise that you are honor-bound not to fight again until you've been exchanged for a prisoner on the other side. And so depending on the balance of how many prisoners both sides had, sometimes people will be paroled and then immediately exchanged, and sometimes they paroled and they have to wait for a series of months before they had been notified and be properly exchanged, and then they could rejoin their regiments. And this is really, for modern people thinking about this, is a really an extraordinary system that you would let enemy prisoners of war go under the promise they're not going to fight again. But it seems as if soldiers in the Civil War era took these promises not to fight again extraordinarily seriously. And we have very, very few accounts of people violating the pledges that they've made. But one of the things that happens with the Dix Hill Cartel is that Confederate and Union prisons alike basically empty overnight in 1862, in July of 1862, when this gets passed. Few soldiers benefited more from the Dix Hill Cartel's provisions than Confederate Alexander Hunter, and this is Hunter here on the screen on the left. Hunter enlisted after Fort Sumter. He fought in a number of battles. He fought at Bull Run. He fought during the Peninsula Campaign. And near the end of the 7 days, his regiment found itself outnumbered and broke into a fairly chaotic retreat. He hides in a ditch with a few other soldiers. And when the Union line approaches, Hunter and his colleagues yell, "Billy Yank, we surrender," and he's taken prisoner. And Hunter describes being very well treated as a prisoner. He says that they were given rations of crackers, coffee, and sugar and meat of good quality and fair quantity. And he's put on a steamboat then up to a prison in Boston Harbor at Fort Warren. And Hunter says that his conditions there at Fort Warren were actually quite good. He says that certainly no prisoners of war have been ever treated so luxuriously before. Breakfast consisted of coffee, fresh loaf bread, mess beef, hominy, broiled eggs, and ham. And that 3 weeks of such fare had transformed the hungry, gaunt crowd that had surrendered into, in his words, well-dressed, lazy men sauntering about the fort. And he's in prison in Fort Warren when the Dix Hill Cartel takes effect. And then he is immediately returned to his regiment. And he writes in his diary, "Well, of course, we were glad to go and yet sorry, because after all, he's getting probably better food at Fort Warren than he's going to get back with his regiment." And he describes it later. He says, "The federal government had treated us royally, and our captivity was but a summer jaunt north, an ocean voyage, and several weeks' guest at a watering place." He rejoins his regiment in time to fight at 2nd Manassas and participate in Lee's march into Maryland. He's on the extreme Confederate right at Antietam, and his regiment takes heavy casualties, and he surrenders a second time. And his second captivity proves even shorter than the first. He's paroled 2 days after Antietam. He's given full rations. He's allowed to return home. After a few weeks with his family, he is notified that he's been exchanged, and he returns to service in time to participate in the defense of Fredericksburg. So within 80 days, Hunter had surrendered twice. And his quick return to arms after each episode, I think, indicates not only the efficiency of the Dix Hill Cartel, this prisoner exchange agreement, but really how mild his treatment was as a prisoner. The Dix Hill cartel lasted for a little bit more than a year before it starts to break down. It breaks down starting in the mid-1863, and really by 1864 it has completely collapsed. And there's two factors that really lead to the collapse of the Dix Hill cartel. The first is that both sides accuse the other of manipulating the system, claiming that they were owed more soldiers in exchange than the other side thought, so there were accounting issues. But the second reason, and the more important reason really, why it collapsed is because of the introduction of African American soldiers. When the Union Army starts to enlist African Americans in large numbers, the Confederate government says they do not consider them to be legitimate soldiers and would not be treated as legitimate soldiers if captured on the battlefield. The official Confederate policy was that captured African Americans in uniform would be returned to a state of slavery, whether they were runaway slaves or not. In practice, though, the Confederate policy on captured African Americans is that they'd be executed on the battlefield or shortly thereafter. And in response to this, when the Confederacy says that they're not going to treat all Union soldiers the same, were they to be captured on the battlefield, the Union government says, if you don't treat all of our soldiers the same, you're not abiding by the terms of our agreement, and the agreement is off. And so by 1864, the system of parole and exchange really is dead. And prisoners of war then are going to stay in prison until exchange is reopened. And there's always rumors going around prisons during this point that exchange is going to be reopened. And it doesn't, unfortunately, for them until the final months of the war. It's this collapse of prisoner exchange, I argue in the book, that really lead to the kind of horrific conditions at Andersonville and other prisons in 1864. As prison populations dramatically increase and new prisons open to accommodate the overflow. Andersonville, I think many of you know, only opens in 1864 because they all of a sudden have this huge inrush of number of prisoners because of the exchange system falling apart. And many historians have observed that the character of fighting in the Civil War changes in 1864 into what some have called the hard war. And what I argue in the book is that the collapse of prisoner exchange, I think, contributes to this. When Dix Hill was in effect, soldiers had a good incentive to surrender, knowing that they would be paroled and exchanged. So if they found themselves in a situation where they were outnumbered, surrendering seemed like a very good option. A much better option than dying on the battlefield unnecessarily. After its collapse, however, soldiers knew that if they surrender, they'd end up in a prison like Andersonville, where the conditions, I think, as all of you know, were really horrific. Conditions in Union prisons were equally ghastly. And so the option of surrendering on the battlefield seems like a much less attractive option when this is the likely outcome. Commanding officers make the same kind of calculus. There are far fewer formal surrenders in 1864 than any other year of the war. And few people understood how the prison experience and how the surrender experience changed as well as our friend Alexander Hunter. In January of 1864, he surrenders for a third time. At this point, he's been shifted into a cavalry regiment. He's off on a scouting mission. He encounters a Union patrol. He tries to hide in a nearby church, but they surround the church and they force him to surrender. And now he's in a situation where he is surrendering without the possibility of being paroled. And he quickly grows very despondent in prison. He writes, "It was a bitter thing to look forward to, that of being caged like so many wild beasts." And he really recognized that surrender now for his third time was very different than the first two times he surrendered. For Northerner and Southerner alike, he wrote, "Dragging out of prison life was grievous enough to bear. Many held death a preferable fate." And he ends up spending most of the rest of the war in prison. For some combatants in the Civil War, I argue in the book, surrender was never really an option, and really the entire war looked like the hard war you see in 1864. Because the enemy did not recognize them as legitimate soldiers, African Americans, Southern Unionists, and guerrillas largely didn't have the option to surrender that other soldiers did. Many of you, I think, are probably familiar with the massacre of African American soldiers at Fort Pillow in 1864 by Confederate forces underneath in Bedford Forest. But this is really only one of many cases in which Black soldiers were not allowed to surrender. And knowing that Confederates would not accept their surrender prompted African Americans to fight that much more fiercely. One USCT officer noted that the men under his command fight like bloodhounds and never surrender. And some Black soldiers concluded that if Confederates would not accept their surrender, they were under no obligation to accept the surrenders of Confederate soldiers. We are outlawed, one wrote, and therefore not bound by the rules of regular warfare. So they're saying essentially, if we don't have the option to surrender ourselves, we're not going to let anybody else surrender. And a similar dynamic plays out for Southern Unionists and guerrillas. Southern Unionists are often seen by Confederate soldiers as being traitors to the South, and so they're often not allowed to surrender. Guerrillas, most of whom are fighting for the Confederacy, are viewed by the Union government as being not legitimate soldiers and therefore not given the option of surrendering. And that changes the way in which they're going to fight. Surrender obviously plays a huge role in the end of the Civil War. And I could probably talk for hours about the ways in which surrender shaped the final months of the conflict. But I thought I'd finish with talking about some of the ways in which surrender in a broad way shaped the war's conclusion and its aftermath. The first is that starting in early 1865, the Lincoln administration saw surrender as the way to end the war quickly and with the least amount of bloodshed. Once it becomes clear the Union is going to win the war, the Lincoln administration is trying to find a way to end the war with the least amount of loss of life on both sides. And they thought if they offered generous terms of surrender, that would entice Confederates to lay down weapons and to stop the bloodshed. And so Lincoln, when he meets with his generals, when he meets with Grant, when he meets with Sherman, when he meets with other officers, he tells them to offer very generous terms. Confederate soldiers would be allowed, given immediate paroles, and they're going to be allowed to return home. They're going to be given rations, and in some cases, they're given transportation. They are not going to go to prison, and they're not going to be prosecuted for treason, right? So they're going to give extraordinarily generous terms and hoping that that offer of a very generous surrender is going to end the war quickly. And you see that in all of the terms of surrender in the various places with war's conclusion. The terms are offered are really very generous. The second way in which surrender shaped the end of the Civil War is the Confederacy itself, the political entity, never surrendered. So it's not like the Japanese Empire surrendering at the end of the Second World War. And the Confederacy itself didn't surrender for two reasons. One is that Lincoln told his generals not to allow the Confederacy itself to surrender. And Lincoln's rationale for this was that from the very beginning of the war, Lincoln's position was that secession was unconstitutional and the Confederacy itself was illegal and something of a fiction. So when Lincoln talks about the Confederacy throughout the war, he always talks about it as the so-called Confederacy. And the Lincoln administration really bends over backwards throughout the war to try to prevent any kind of political recognition of the Confederacy as a legitimate government. One of the things Lincoln's worried about at the end of the war is if they recognize a Confederate surrender at the end of the war, if they allow Jefferson Davis to surrender, that would legitimize Jefferson Davis as a political leader, even in the moments of the Confederacy's death. because if the Confederacy dies, that implies the Confederacy was once alive. So Lincoln is very clear that military surrenders are okay, surrenders of armies are okay, surrenders of soldiers are okay, surrenders of generals are okay, but the political surrenders are not. Jefferson Davis, in this ironic way, actually agrees with Lincoln, but for very different reasons. As the Confederacy is collapsing, there are a number of his aides who urge Jefferson Davis to surrender. And Jefferson Davis says, no, I don't think that's a good idea, and anyway, I don't think I have the power to do so. Jefferson Davis argues that he says, look, I have an enormous amount of power given to me by the Confederate Constitution as president, but I do not have power to effectively commit suicide for this government. I have to keep on fulfilling the terms of my office as long as I can, and surrender is not one of those choices that's available to me. So in this way, an interesting way, both Lincoln and Davis agree the Confederacy itself can't surrender. So what you have instead of one large surrender is a number of small surrenders, starting with Appomattox Courthouse and continuing for weeks and months thereafter. My third point I'd like to make about the way in which surrender shaped the end of the war is that in each of the 5 major Confederate surrenders at the end of the war, and a number of smaller ones you can see on the map, they each unfolded slightly differently. And it's tempting to look at them and say, oh, well, all of these are Appomattox Courthouse repeated over and over again over the following weeks. But if you look at them individually, they actually each unfold differently depending upon the disposition of the officers, the relative strengths of the forces involved, and the broader political context. And just to give you an example, I'll point out the surrender of Confederate forces at Bennett Place, which is near Durham, North Carolina today, Durham Station then, which happens a few weeks after Appomattox Courthouse. It's often sort of seen as a sequel, but in some ways the situation is very different. Grant, going into Appomattox Courthouse, knows precisely what his president wants him to do. After all, he's talked with Lincoln. He knows exactly what the federal government wants him to do at negotiations. Sherman, on the other hand, when Sherman goes to meet with Johnston at Bennett Place, does not know what the president wants him to do because he finds out the morning he's going to go meet with Johnston that President Lincoln has been assassinated and a new president has taken office, Andrew Johnson, whom he doesn't know and doesn't know what Johnson wants him to do. This then shapes the outcome of the negotiations they have at Bennett Place. Another ways in which the two are different is that Lee's army was surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse and Johnston's army is not surrounded at Bennett Place, surrounded at Bennett Place. And Johnston points this out to Sherman. He says, look, Lee's army was surrounded, my army is not. My army can retreat further west if it wants to, and therefore I deserve better terms than what Lee received. And if you sort of take apart these other surrenders that happen after Bennett Place, you find a similar kind of dynamic playing out where they each tell a slightly different story, even if the outcome is similar. The fourth point I'd like to make about surrender at the end of the war is that many of the participants in these surrenders are drawing upon prior experience with surrender when it comes to the war's conclusion. Grant, for instance, had secured the surrenders at Fort Donelson and Vicksburg before he gets to Appomattox Courthouse. And indeed, in fact, his role in those surrenders as the victor is really what promoted him to being the head of the Union Army. And with his, if you look at Grant's officers, lots of them had also been involved in surrenders, either people who've been involved in the accepting of an enemy surrender or surrendering themselves. 1 out of every 5 of Lee's soldiers had previously surrendered. So when they receive their paroles at Appomattox Courthouse, they know precisely what it means. They are drawing upon this experiences of what surrender means and what surrender looks like from prior experiences in the war. The fifth and sort of final point I want to make about the way in which surrender shapes the end of the war is that most Confederates were very happy ultimately to be able to lay down their arms and return home. They were, after all, given very generous terms. They were allowed to maintain as much of their honor as they could in defeat. But in each of these surrenders, there's a small fraction of Confederate soldiers who refused to accept surrender or refused to accept their commander's decision to surrender and left hoping to join another Confederate army. At Appomattox Courthouse, there were some soldiers from Lee's army who left, who wanted to join Johnston's army. At Bennett Place, there were some who left to try to fight to join Taylor's army or Forrest's army or Kirby Smith's army out in the West. And in fact, when Kirby Smith eventually surrenders, there's some section of his army that decides to march into Mexico because they refuse to accept surrender and they refuse to live under the Union flag. Mexico is in the midst of a civil war at this point, and this sort of battalion of former Confederates marches into Mexico and offers their services to either side of the Mexican Civil War that wants to have them. And both sides, I think, wisely turn them down and say, no, we're fine, thank you. What's interesting about these men, though, the ones who refused to accept surrender in 1865, is many of them continued to resist the federal government in the years that followed. Many of them became the founding members of paramilitary organizations across the South, like the Ku Klux Klan. This study of surrender, I think, suggests the Civil War was both more civilized and more savage than we thought. The ubiquity of surrender throughout the conflict indicates that most Civil War soldiers and officers believed they were fighting in a civilized war, one in which soldiers had the right to surrender and the expectation of humane treatment as prisoners. Take, for example, the case of Thomas Benton Alexander, and he's pictured there in the center, along with his brothers. Alexander was a Tennessee farmer who surrendered 3 times over the course of the war. He enlisted at the age of 22 in October of 1861. He's stationed at Fort Donelson, where he surrenders with Simon Buckner in 1862. He's imprisoned in Chicago briefly. He's exchanged under the Dix Hill Cartel. He's then assigned to Garrison Port Hudson, which surrenders in July of 1863. He's exchanged again. He's posted at Fort Morgan, and there surrenders a 3rd time in August of 1864. And he spends basically the rest of the war in prison. He's finally paroled in March of 1865, so right before the war ends. And he sort of travels through the South on his way home. He takes a train from Richmond, where he's released, to Charlotte, and then he meanders some 600 miles on foot across the Carolinas and Alabama before ending up in Barnesville, Georgia, where he hires himself out to a local farmer. And what's, I think, interesting and important about the experiences of men like Thomas Benton Alexander is, on one hand, you can look at men like them and say, look, they've been very unfortunate in their Civil War experience. These are men who were unfortunately had to surrender 3 times. On the other hand, there's a way of looking at Thomas Benton Alexander and say this is a man who is extraordinarily lucky. That if he had been fighting in a different kind of war, a war in which he couldn't surrender, men like Thomas Benton Alexander wouldn't have been able to eventually return home and die at the age of 90, not far from where he was born. He was lucky because, as someone who was not in one of the categories of soldiers that was prohibited from surrendering, Thomas Benton Alexander knew that he would receive fair treatment as a prisoner of war, and he benefited from a robust military culture that embraced the fair treatment of prisoners as a hallmark of civilized warfare. As a counterfactual, consider what the Civil War would have looked like if the option to surrender had been taken off the table, and men like Thomas Benton Alexander had been compelled to fight to death rather than allowed to surrender. Undoubtedly, the death toll would have been much, much higher. Imagine what would have happened, for instance, if Union forces had been forced to attack Vicksburg and actually have a pitched battle there. How long would soldiers have been willing to fight if every battle resembled Fort Pillow or the Crater? Recognizing the central role of surrender in the Civil War, I think, requires some reconsideration of what being an American means. If Americans define themselves as a people who never give up, never compromise, and never surrender, what does it mean that during the defining moment in American history, Americans surrendered in droves? And for many of us today, take no prisoners and never surrender, I guess they serve as mantras, signifying ideological purity and a relentless work ethic. Yet if we're to learn anything from the Civil War generation, we might come to see surrender not as a sign of weakness, but as a hallmark of humanity. I want to thank you all for listening to me talk about the book today. I'm looking forward to the questions later. I can tell you, if you're interested in getting a copy of Raising the White Flag, it's available online at all the sort of major venues on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and what have you, both as a hardcover and as an ebook. You can also get it at the UNC Press website, where they're currently selling it at 40% off, so go ahead and buy it there. I should also point out, for those of you who are interested, I've got two other earlier books that are available. One called Driven from Home, North Carolina's Civil War Refugee Crisis, which looks at the experience of civilians in North Carolina during the Civil War. And another book called Moments of Despair. These are all very happy, uplifting books, as you can tell from the titles. Moments of Despair, Suicide, Divorce, and Debt in Civil War Era North Carolina, which looks at the trauma of war and the ways in which different communities process that trauma. So thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to your questions.